Hello and welcome to Collaborating for Access, a webinar series sponsored by the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies, COSLA, the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, and Readers First. Here representing COSLA is Jeremy Johannesson, Executive Director of COSLA. Hello, Jeremy. I'm Michael Blackwell, Director of St. Mary's County Library and Project Manager for the Readers First Working Group. For at least a decade and a half, libraries have worked to integrate ebooks and digital audiobooks into their collections seamlessly and well, but often having trouble with license terms that do not support fundamental aspects of our mission. Today, we're going to explore going beyond licensing to ownership of digital books. We have a panel of 4 who have been leaders in this area. We'll hear from our panel and then have a question and answer period. We look forward to your questions. Please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom, not the chat, so that we can more easily track them. Now let's meet our panel. Michael Weinberg is the Executive Director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy at the New York University School of Law, as well as the Board President of the Open Source Hardware Association. Prior to NYU, he was a General Counsel at the 3D printing company Shapeways. He spent many years in Washington, D.C. advocating for the public interest in technology policy at the nonprofit Public Knowledge. He will lead with an overview of the legal distinction between licensing and ownership, and why ownership may matter from a legal perspective. Christina de Castell is the Chief Librarian and CEO at Vancouver Public Library, and has held roles bridging technology, collections, research, and public service, and has been an influential leader in creating a better library digital content experience. She will share a library perspective on why digital library ownership matters. Hello, Christina. Micah May is DPLA's Director of Ebook Services, overseeing Palace Marketplace and related ebook work. He previously served as Director of Technology for Library for All, creating open children's books and free reading apps for the developing world. Before joining DPLA, Mike was Director of Strategy and then Senior Director of Business Development and Innovation at the New York Public Library. Michael will discuss DPLA's deciding to develop the ownership model in the Palace project. Hello, Micah. Richard T. Williams is Vice President of Business Development, Publishing and Licensing at the Independent Publishers Group, IPG. Throughout their career, Richard has been a champion for independent publishing in a rapidly changing industry, including investigating how libraries and independent publishers can better work together to promote reading. Rich will discuss IPG's attitude towards libraries and why IPG has invited publishers to enable this model, providing us with a publisher perspective. So first, Michael Weinberg, take it away, please.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you to all the organizers for putting this together and all of you for being here. So as Michael said, my role here is to talk a little bit about sort of the conceptual difference between a sale and a license. And I'm going to start with ownership and sales, because these are things that we are all very familiar with. All of us have sold something, all of us have purchased something, all of us have owned something in our lives. And when you think about ownership and you think about transfers of ownership, this is something that it happens so often that you don't even maybe think about it as a legal structure or as a legal innovation. But in fact, it is a legal structure and a legal innovation that we've now had for millennia. And the rules around what happens when one person owns something and transfers that ownership to someone else have developed over those hundreds of years, thousands of years, to be a balance between the person who started with the thing at the beginning of the transaction and the person who ended with the thing at the end of the transaction. One of the things that's important about a sale and like a transfer of ownership is conceptually, there's a moment in time where ownership transfers from one person to another person, right? Once the transfer is complete, it is done, it has happened, and the new owner can do what they want with the thing that they now own, right? When you buy a house, you can redecorate the house. If you buy a car, you can resell your car. If you have a painting that you love, you can pass it down onto your heirs. And this is great, right? Like, you are the owner of it, you have full control over it, and it has a lot of really great benefits. One is that it keeps things really simple, right? You are the complete owner of it. You're the person who's responsible for it. When you buy a painting, You don't need a list of the contact information of every person who's owned that painting in the past, because they still get a say as to where you hang it in your house, like how you light it. Also, the previous owner, they don't get to keep tabs on what's happening with it. Like, they don't get to tell you that you can't paint the wall in your house blue, or that you can't put like new rims on your car, right? They're out of the picture. They are gone. And the previous owner can't then continue to dictate terms. So they can't keep track of what you're doing, and they can't keep telling you what to do, because you are the owner and that you have full control. Now, not incidentally, right? This idea of ownership is what makes libraries possible, right? When you or a library or anyone buys a book, you can loan it out to anyone you want, right? You can, the publisher, the original publisher can't say, you can't loan it to these kinds of people, or you can only loan it 2 times. No, like, they have sold it, they're out of the picture, and now you as the owner get to decide what happens with the book that you own. And so if you're a library and you purchased it, you can loan it out to people. If you're an individual and you purchased it, you can give it to a library to do whatever they want. And you don't have to tell the publisher, you don't have to tell the original owner. You have full control over the object. Now, all of this kind of ownership and sale talk is designed, not surprisingly, to set up a little bit of a contrast with licensing, right? Licensing is not a sale, right? There's not a moment in time where ownership transfers from the original owner to a new owner. Instead, the original owner, the licensor, retains ownership of the object, and then gives specific permissions to specific people or groups of people for things that they can do with it. So those permissions can be, well, you can only loan it to somebody 3 times, or you have to tell me everyone who reads this book. Those permissions can be modified over time. The original owner gets to maintain control over how the thing is used and gets to track how it is used. And so, how did we get to this point? Physical books obviously are sold, have been sold since time immemorial, for reasons that I'm happy to talk about now, but I'm not going to talk about now. Digital goods have tended to be licensed over the last, 2 or 3 decades, and so ebooks also tend to be licensed. There's sort of no law that has to be that way. It just sort of is the way that the market has evolved. And you can understand why, if you're in the business of selling or licensing ebooks, you might want that, right? Because if a sale is a transaction where both parties come in, get something of value, and then go away, licensing can often allow the licensor to kind of get both sides of the deal, right? So a publisher who licenses an ebook gets both sides of the deal. They get paid, which is great, and they decide how the ebook is used, which they'll take if they can get. On the other side, the sort of purchasers, the licensors, get neither of those things. They get the opportunity to pay money, so they lose some money, but they also don't get say or control over how those ebooks are used. And so the balance that's been set up for centuries and millennia between sellers and purchasers has been kind of upset and rebalanced in favor of the licensor in the context of the license. So I'm going to stop there. Happy to talk about all those things later, but that's sort of the kind of basic framework of this ownership, the sale where the ownership is in control is transferred, and the license where the original licensor gets to maintain control.
Thank you so much, Michael. And now we have Christina to give us a library perspective. Christina, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. So what I'm going to talk about is a bit of the perspective of the library and how we got here. So a bit of history of this conversation. And what I think is really important is that fundamentally, without the ownership of content, libraries are going to be unable to fulfill our mandate of preserving our culture. In a digital world, we risk becoming a place that is about transitory reading and learning and no longer being the repositories of knowledge that we have been throughout time. This is fundamentally a core role of libraries, and it is one that is at serious risk in the digital world, and particularly in a licensing environment. There are a number of considerations, and Michael has been talking about the legal aspects a bit. I think that it was quite interesting. I came to begin thinking about this back in 2011 and 2012, when in Canada we were having our first conversations with Random House, and we were talking about our interest in buying ebooks. So at the time, ebooks were not available for sale to Canadian libraries, and they were talking about the author agreements. So they were saying that there were limitations in what they could sell to libraries or how they could license to us based on those author agreements. And those were the first conversations we had about perpetual access and what might make ebook licensing different. But it didn't become clear how problematic the licensing world was going to be until HarperCollins introduced the 26 circulation model around 2012. And at that point, it became very clear that ongoing access was something that we needed. And we started to really talk about the consequences of time or loan-based models. And since we now are in an environment where most of our content from major publishers is in those models, we really see what it means to not have ownership and to primarily be dealing with these time-limited models. It changes what libraries buy. If something isn't likely to circulate enough to make the cost worthwhile in the time that we will have this license available to us, we don't buy it. This has the biggest effect on mid-list and new authors who we aren't going to take the risks on that we would have in a print environment where that book might sit on the shelves for 10 years and be discovered very slowly and grow in its popularity over time or have a niche audience. It also, in these time and loan-based models, changes what libraries buy and increases our administration. So a lot more work to make the decision of this book made sense to buy in a license model 2 years ago, but it no longer does make sense. The circulation is just not going to be as high. And I'm speaking today primarily from a public library standpoint. So when that gives you a bit of the overview of perpetual access and ownership versus license space. But then what's the difference from a library perspective in ownership versus perpetual access? One of the places this shows up most clearly is when we decide we want to transfer our content between platforms. We work primarily in an environment where we're not in control of our platforms for ebook lending. And we need to have the confidence that when we buy something, it can be moved from one platform to another. We first saw this problem come up when we were transferring between platforms in the early days of ebook lending. So from Overdrive to 3M, for example, it was a big conversation of could libraries move the content that they bought on Overdrive to the 3M platform? And those were perpetual licenses for those books. And it actually required going to each publisher and asking them if the content could be moved. The content had been purchased, the licenses were still in effect, but it was an enormous administrative task. First, to get the agreement that both Overdrive and 3M would let this happen, and then to talk with each of the individual publishers to find out how tightly attached the license was to the platform. And for many, this was it was simply a lack of awareness that this was even an issue. And so it arose that it was possible in most cases to make this transfer, but it was not guaranteed. And this aspect of the platform where we save things, the platform we lend from, is something that we really need to think about further, because our access is almost always mediated through a platform owned by a third party. We want to be able to think about, can we store this on our own server one day? Can we store it on our server now? Do we have a copy? Can we preserve the ebook in backups? Can we transfer it between formats as formats become obsolete? We may, because of our concerns about patron privacy, want to store things on our own platforms and lend from them in the future. So while this might not be a big concern for us now, it could come to be. When we think about why copyright law and why licensing matters to library, as Michael was talking about, we often don't really think about what is the difference between buying and licensing. Perpetual access sounds like ownership, but what we're looking for is the same rights that we had in print. Libraries are unique entities in copyright law, and we have special exceptions. They allow us to copy works when a format is obsolete, when a file is damaged, and they allow us to preserve. They allow us to undertake interlibrary loan. We may not care that much about whether we can resell something or give it away, while we have those rights in print. But I think that Michael's made that point, it is characteristic of ownership. But fundamentally, just to come back to my first point, this is about libraries' mandate to preserve our local culture through the written word, to preserve knowledge through the written word. When something goes out of print, it is often libraries that have had the only copy of the work. And in fact, in Denmark, when publishers first wanted to create ebooks, there were cases where the publishers had to get a print copy from libraries in order to make the ebooks. We have, throughout the world, national deposit concepts in national libraries and archives that recognize the importance of libraries for collecting the learning, the knowledge, the culture of countries. And we need the concepts of ownership to make that role in preservation possible. A well thought out and negotiated license can meet many of our needs, but it doesn't have that universality that ownership does, that doesn't compromise, isn't compromised in situations where a library negotiator is perhaps not in a position of power in a negotiation. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to Michael.
Thank you so much for Christina. Very interesting. At this point, we're going to turn it over to Micah for a vendor perspective.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah. And I don't think DPLA so much as a vendor as a partner. We are a nonprofit. The whole Palace stack is driven by nonprofits. And our goal is really to help libraries maximize access for their patrons. And another part of that goal is to make sure that publishers, authors, and other rights holders are treated fairly. In my experience, librarians want publishers and authors to get paid. They value the work of not only creating books, but the curatorial function the publishers play. And so our goal is always to find the win-wins where both sides are benefiting. And we think that we have done that here. So I want to just talk briefly about kind of how we came to this and why we decided to take on this goal of launching a different kind of ownership model that has been tried in the past. And then I'll show you a few of the titles that are available. I think they're really exciting. So, I've been working in library land for over a decade, and library ownership, to some degree, as Christina described, has been a little bit of a holy grail for libraries. I think the idea that they would actually own the digital versions of the books they were acquiring. And as many of you know, this was tried by Douglas County, by Queens Library in New York, by Khalifa. And for the most part, those projects didn't really scale. The Douglas County and Queens models were ultimately shut down. Khalifa is no longer acquiring books on that model. And that's because the technology was too much work, frankly, to maintain the server environment that's necessary to keep these files safe, to ingest ONIX and files from publishers, was just not a scalable activity for libraries. And so it kind of faded. And then I heard this reemerge in the library conversation starting over the last few years. And I heard more and more library, thought leaders talking about how important it was the library owned books. But what I didn't hear were a lot of practical solutions for how that was going to happen. Enter Palace. Palace is a nonprofit-driven, mostly open source platform, and it's really a platform for innovation. And that sounds like kind of a buzzword, but it's very accurate. It's literally a software platform, and it enables libraries to innovate. And it does that by being open in the sense of using interoperable components to allow a library to plug in different pieces. So that can be different kinds of content providers. It can be different authentication mechanisms. And in this case, it can also be different models for ownership. or for licensing. So a lot of my work over the past few years at DPLA has been working with publishers to find models that will work better for libraries and that are still fair to publishers and authors. And we've done that with a number of different licensing models, and now are able to bring an ownership model to the market, which we're really excited about. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and just very quickly touch on the actual details of this model. Hopefully you're seeing that now. And I'm not gonna read you this whole page. This is literally a lot of the verbatim contract language, but I will drop it also in the chat so that you all can peruse this at your leisure if you'd like to. But in short, this tries to recreate something similar to print in digital. So, libraries have basically the rights that are available in the first sale doctrine. They also have limits. So libraries are asked to lend this to only one user at a time, to apply standard digital rights management software to make sure the software is safe. And while the content can be transferred, it has to be to a host that has a secure server environment. With that said, the libraries are able to share the book with other libraries that are part of a consortia. They could use interlibrary loan, which has always been available in print. As Christina described, they could potentially reproduce the work to migrate it into a updated or modern format, all of the other rights that come with ownership in the print context. So again, I'll drop that link in the chat in a second if anyone wants to look more at the legal details, and I'm always available for questions about that. But more exciting, I'd like to show you some of the books that libraries can now own. So this is the Palace Marketplace. Again, it's a nonprofit-driven marketplace where libraries can acquire all kinds of ebooks and audiobooks. In total, we have over 1.5 million titles because there's a whole separate catalog here with self-published titles. So to find the own content, you just go to that all titles and hit the ownership model. And what you'll see are close to 40,000 titles that libraries can own. These are from various publishers that work with IPG as a distribution partner. Richard will be talking a little bit about that next. And you'll see that many of them are very reasonably priced. So one of the wonderful things that I get to do is manage DPLA's Curation Core. The Curation Core is a group of about a dozen librarians, most of them still working full-time, a few retired, that work with us part-time to help with curatorial tasks. So they review the openly licensed content in the Palace bookshelf. They help libraries build carts based on their own collection development priorities. And they also do selections of other content that we want to feature and help libraries find. So this is a wonderful collection of 50 of these books that libraries can own that was put together by one of our Curation Core members, Miriam Tullio. And these are all really high quality books every library should own. And you'll notice that all 50 books is just under $1,500. So it comes out to a little less than $30 a title for a title that the library can own indefinitely. If you're in the marketplace, you can also see the detailed legal terms and some frequently asked questions about the model there. So in particular, just highlighting a couple of these titles. I will admit Miriam picked these and kind of gave me a crib sheet on them. So thanks to her for that. So Candlemas Bay is a really cozy book about life in small town Maine. I Have the Answers is a really witty collection of short stories and poems by this award-winning poet. This is from Wayne State University, which has a number of really exciting offerings in this ownership model. And Loose Ends is a debut thriller, a really fun, fast read. So those are just a couple of examples of the really cool, those are all kind of adult fiction. There's a lot of literary fiction. There's some academic titles. So these are a few of our selections of titles that libraries can now own. So I'm really excited about this. I think it's something the libraries have been working towards for a long time. I'm proud that Palace could offer a platform that enabled this kind of innovation. And I'm really grateful for publishing partners who I think have proven that really ultimately libraries and publishers are on the same team. We're on Team Reading. And IPG has been a wonderful partner. They were one of the first partners we worked with to offer our other preferred licensing models and now have brought this forward. So I hope that the library community will reward them by buying a lot of these own books. And I look forward to your questions during this webinar or following it. So Michael, over to Richard.
Well, that sounds like a segue to me, and we're going to now hear from Richard of IPG about the publisher perspective. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Micah, for such nice words about IPG. So I'm Richard T. Williams. I am the VP of Business Development for IPG, which is a full-service trade distributor based in Chicago. I've been with the company for about 20 years, and my role is to work with publisher clients whose programs and titles need a good distribution solution, and to help them build up their business once they have signed on to IPG. That means I oversee about 200 publishers, but I only work really closely with about 50 of them, with maybe another 50 regularly publishing who check in with me from time to time. And just to be clear, my publishers are genuinely independent publishing programs, unaffiliated with the Big Five in New York, who publish anywhere from 2 to 10 to 50 titles annually. These are traditional houses with royalty payout models, not author contribution models. And my clients range from trade publishers like our own Chicago Review Press, which celebrates its 50th anniversary in 2021, to university presses and professional organizations like the Health Administration Press, the Hoover Institution Press at Stanford, and the Society for Human Resource Management. As a distributor, we curate and conglomerate multiple smaller lists into one massive one in order to get better business terms with the accounts and to compete with the major houses. And I think we are our top 20 vendor to the industry. IPG is one of the few independent distributors left for both print and digital, and we've opted into the relationship with DPLA for and its ownership initiative for a number of reasons. The first and major one being that we support libraries, and we know that our publishers do. Libraries are the bedrock of our communities. They are fundamental to our education systems, and they are a primary source of exposure for an independent publisher. Often an author who is able to find their book at their local library that fulfills a particular dream for them that got them writing in the first place. Second, we believe that digital distribution is more competitive the more channels that you reach. And this is related to the third point, which is our publishers often see the digital sphere as the primary way to market their titles, both ebooks and print. The more your books are discoverable, the more you can sell, and IPG offering books to models that aren't traditional is the best way to make books more discoverable. Finally, as with much of our business, the existing structure of the ebook market is more beneficial to the wholesalers and the resellers who are bringing the content to the libraries than it is to the libraries themselves, which is totally fine for publishers who see steady and significant revenue from that model. But for most independent publishers, getting placement in libraries is not taken for granted. And this model can deepen library support for our publishers, as well as deepen publisher support of the libraries. So I want to point out that, as the name suggests, Independent Publishers Group means that our publishers are often fiercely independent, and they expect us to look out for them. Being their distributor means that I represent them in the trade, and I have a responsibility to my clients. I'm not going to lead them down some negative path. So we have made the DPLA initiative an opt-out model for our publishers, which means that they're all inclusive unless they have a reason why they don't want to participate, which is true of any other ebook model that we have that breaks from tradition in some way. But being independent is a crucial distinction from the major New York houses because it makes the playing field very competitive. Our publishers don't often have the money to make really big things happen for their titles. And online discoverability and or placement in libraries is not a foregone conclusion, especially when constantly competing in the space with the major houses and with limited budgets. So I think the DPLA ownership model should see far more pushback from the major houses than my clients, because the revenue stream is a pretty significant chunk of the business. And the primary concern from publishers seems to be a loss of revenue from this sales model. But my publishers don't publish the kinds of books for which libraries often buy multiple copies and repurchase when they hit some kind of license limit, such as, a length of time or the number of checkouts, like was discussed before. My publishers are happy just to get that one first placement in a library, and even expect sometimes that after the front list life of the book has ended, that their titles could be excised from collections, which means, not repurchased. So just for fun, I did a deep dive on our overall ebook sales numbers for 2023. And just to be clear, our percentage of overall sales to digital libraries is under 5%. Now that's of the entire piece, with print sales and Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Baker and Taylor and everybody else that we sell to. But for digital libraries, it is under 5%. And for most regular trade publishers on my list who have both print and digital books, that number is actually under 3%. And I'm not using that to say that this is not a significant piece of the market. I'm saying that, in terms of revenue, it doesn't always move the needle that much. So for the smaller publishers, getting their books in more places is simply more important. Of course, now our publishers that have professional and academic audiences have much higher percentages than that. But the most important thing that I've gleaned from this data, and obviously I kind of need to work on it a little more, is that if one of my publishers cites revenue as the reason why they may not want to participate in the ownership initiative, it feels somewhat assumptive and not exactly accurate. So I'm here to speak on behalf of the publisher perspective. So here's a list of some of the other points about this model that I've drawn from some of my colleagues. For the most part, my publishers don't really know the difference between a licensure and an ownership model as long as the ebook is sold in perpetuity and loaned out to one user at a time. In other words, most of my publishers don't see any potential loss of revenue, and they have yet to see the benefits of the ownership model, but they're all willing to try it. Taking that a little further, in order to learn more, publishers want regular communication about this model. They need progress reports about the growth in the initiative, and for some kind of metric to be available to them that measures the success of their titles in this market via, instead of the traditional wholesaler subscription models that currently dominate. That's obviously, as somebody who, has to see to my clients, that's my responsibility to help engage them and communicate with them, but I will continue to work with the initiative to make sure that I do that. A lot of the data that they can now see if they research this on their own actually dates back historically to 2012 and before. So, the fact that we're doing this now, I think, is a crucial turning point. One of the major reasons for opt-out, like I said before, was revenue. Ebooks for libraries should have a higher list price. That's what some publishers believe. The idea for a financially minded publisher is that, you take this digital list price for libraries, you kind of shoot it up, and then they get a bigger piece of the pie. I'm aware that this was historically sort of more of a thing back in the beginning when this conversation started to take shape, and it didn't really take off. But some publishers do feel that more money up front is a fair trade for permanent access to their IP. And the other primary reason for publisher opt-out that I got was they're just protective of their IP. Some publishers like to control their content availability. So I'll use an example of a publisher whose entire mission is based around developing and containing a body of knowledge that is intended to train professionals, and they may not want previous outdated iterations of that body of knowledge circulating forever. But for the most part, publishers want to opt in. They want to sell their books wherever possible. They like the library support. They want more marketability, broader discoverability. I'll use an example of a particular publisher that said that the ebook is sold into the library system, and then because that book pops up in catalogs, they often see second sales when buyers go up and request print copies. So they'll sell ebook and print copies to the same library. They love that. And then finally, and this is actually probably the major reason, some publishers just want to be able to have their books available to their local communities and to be embraced by the culture and be part of that cultural capital and have that conversation around their work. I think that that's where libraries play like the biggest role for a lot of my publishers. So, and then something else I wanted to add, I did ask some publishers on our list about the way that that would impact author agreements, especially with, most traditional author agreements are royalty based, where there's a sliding scale for the number of sales. It's called an escalator. But smart agreements already have ebooks sort of relegated to a revenue model rather than a unit model, because obviously with so many fractional and subscription models, the definition of one unit is kind of variable. So that's what I got from sort of an overview of sort of my publisher base. I hope this has been helpful and it has helped you understand IPG's role in this initiative.
Thank you so much, Richard. And if our panelists could all turn back on their cameras. There we go. First, a comment from the chat. This is from Mike Bushman. This is why the state of Washington started its statewide Simply ePalace ebook collection with IPG and other like-minded publishers 5 years ago, and not with publishers who aren't willing to experiment. Thanks, Richard. So there you go. Kudos, Richard, for your willingness to work with libraries, which is greatly appreciated. Let's move over to our Q&A, and a number of questions came up that were DPLA/Palace specific, and Mike has answered those. Micah, is there any that you'd like to just recap here for our audience?
There were a lot of good questions. I guess the quick thing would be to say, if you're not completely satisfied with the answer, please just reach out to me by email. You can also email the support@Palace, which I will drop again. Doing my best to bang out written answers, but I don't think there's any that we particularly need to go back to. Chelsea
Well,
asked
you
about the
can.
full title list, and I guess it's just a little cumbersome because it's 38,000 titles. That's a lot of lines in a spreadsheet. And so I did drop, in the answer to her question, a list of the 50 largest imprints. Now, these are not necessarily the best. These are the publishers that have the highest number of titles on offer. And I can share the full list of imprints. It's over 800 imprints, so it can be a little overwhelming. So I guess just to say, if any of those questions were not satisfactorily answered, please post it again, follow up with me directly.
Just to summarize a couple of them, you can get a free Palace account, and then you can see the prices. Micah can help you get set up with that if you're interested. Willis asked if the Curation Core will help with individual library collections, and the short answer is yes. And Larissa asked if there's interest in expanding the Palace project to other countries besides US and Canada, and Mike has indicated that looking at New Zealand and have started there, and if you're from a different country and would like to be sort of included, please reach out. Titles available in this program only through Palace, or can they be acquired through other vendors like Overdrive or OCLC? So far, these deals are exclusive to Palace, but we can hope that this will be something that other vendors will look at and see as a success and something libraries want and move forward on it. Thank you for those questions. Let's kind of move on to what is open. Dorothy asked, do you have a way for multiple library systems to purchase and share collections? And Micah, what would your answer to that one be?
Yeah, absolutely. Palace is very flexible in terms of allowing groups of libraries to share collections. We've actually really, I think, helped to push back on some of the restrictions that were frankly coming mostly from distributors on that. The only publisher right now who's really even asking for permission is Hachette. And the only collection I've ever seen them say no to was a Khalifa collection that we shared across multiple states. So generally, yes, that's totally possible. We can set up, we're happy to support consortial acquisitions.
Okay. Herman asked if libraries could circulate proprietary e-reader tablets, like print books with CDL, controlled digital lending, books downloaded by libraries, and books downloaded by patrons from Palace, but not limited Palace. And Micah has said that that has been done. The trouble with it is that it can be somewhat expensive, and as a library director, I can tell you that losing the reader itself can be a fiscal hardship for the customers, for the patrons. So I think that while some libraries have done that, I do think that it's got real advantages, especially in areas where there might be a digital divide, and it's well worth trying based on your own experience as a librarian.
The other thing that made that really expensive, I was part of a pilot of that in New York Public Library probably 10 years ago, is just that you have to put all the books on it checked out, right? So if you think about a tablet going out the door with 20 books on it, that becomes one very expensive lend. But it's a cool model, and I agree, it's nice to make that available to people that don't have the technology. So, keep trying it, keep innovating.
If I could add, we did this in Vancouver in a particular context that I think worked really well, and it was for adults who are struggling readers. So we loaded high interest, low literacy level content onto e-readers. And one of the things that was really interesting about the responses we got for the people, so we worked with some specific community organizations to get those e-readers out to people who were wanting this kind of opportunity to read this kind of content in an ebook environment. They could change the size of the font, which was great for them because it was less intimidating to have fewer words on the page. And so they didn't have to think about the size of the book, the length of the book, the quantity of text. So there are interesting reasons to do different approaches to ebooks, but the practicalities were definitely complicated with loading all the content on and trying to create the mystery themed e-reader and the romance themed e-reader and the Western themed e-reader. And that's the way that we approached it in Vancouver.
A further complication can be that you need to make sure that whatever device you're using is ADA accessible and usable. But I interrupted. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly that I'm struck by these answers about having a dedicated device and how there are potentially interesting use cases, but none of the interesting use cases is a kind of like end around of the licensing issue and like an end around of IP. Like that's a bad reason to do something with a dedicated device. Seems like there are some interesting reasons to do it, but not to solve the sort of licensing ownership problem.
I agree with that, certainly. Ali asks, I work in a medical library. Are there any medical professional books available through this platform? Mike, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yeah, I know that there are some, and I would say if you email me, I will have one of our Curation Core librarians look around and gather those up because I don't know off the top of my head. Richard might have a better sense of what imprints in their catalog have those. It's kind of specialized, but I would be very surprised if there's not some, but I don't know off the top of my head how many.
I mean, I will add that we do have publishers from all walks, and I'd be very surprised if there wasn't something. However, I can also say that with reference to, sort of higher end books in particular markets, a lot of their focus is on different markets. I think Vital Source and Follett and some of these educational suppliers do a lot more business, than the libraries do in some of these cases. Yeah, I mean, we can deep dive on it if you want.
Okay, well, one more from the Q&A, and then I've got a few questions I'd like to ask too. But Willis asked, what would make this a success for other publisher groups to join this Palace project? Richard, maybe you think you could address that, or any of our panelists. What would success look like here, and what would make this attractive for publishers and authors?
I'll start with that because I think I touched on some of that when I was talking. I think that in a lot of cases, this is led by, sort of philosophical reasons, and it's not necessarily a tried model that, you just need publishers who are willing to experiment with, where their discoverability is going to be and the kind of revenue they're expecting. And I believe that there are a lot of publishers out there who are willing to try. I think that, one of the big things you've got with IPG as a partner is you've got a distributor who has, an umbrella over a large publisher base. And sometimes that's the easiest way, is to go over the larger groups of publishers based on, who they're affiliated with. So I would recommend, talking to additional distribution partners and other publishing groups.
Can I ask a quick
let's have
follow-up
our-
question to
Please
Richard
do.
about
Please
that?
go ahead. Yes, thank you, Michael.
Richard, this is something that actually we struggled with a lot when we did a white paper, I think was in the chat earlier. You mentioned a couple times that, like, some of your publishers are interested and excited, and some of them sort of don't know the difference and don't care, which is completely legitimate position, I think. But when you think about publishers who are reluctant, what is your sense of how many of them are reluctant because they have taken the time to, like, fully understand the issue and weighed the pros and cons and come out on one side? And how many of them do you think their reluctance is driven by the fact that just, like, it's not a thing they want to think about, it's not a thing they want to spend time considering on their kind of like global list of business concerns?
So as with everything, Michael, I think that there is a level where it is a matter of education. Some publishers don't want to go there simply because that's not what's traditional. That's not where their revenue lies, whatever it might be. I think a lot of publishers are in it because they do want to make money. But there are publishers who are nonprofits. There are publishers who have a message and they want to basically put their information forth. And I don't think that there is going to be a similar resistance from that. And IPG represents publishers from both sides of that scale. But like I said a few minutes ago, it's about communication. It's about keeping my publishers up to speed on what's happening here. And that's one of the vows that I can make for this initiative, is that I will continue to address this. And if there are publishers who are reluctant, maybe we'll see some change.
Thank you so much for the follow-up there, Michael. So let's have our panel solve the big problem. The big problem for a library perspective is that, especially from the big 5 publishers, digital is becoming unsustainable. We're spending 25 to 33% at least of our annual, ebook cost on simply relicensing. And it's very difficult to keep up a collection when you're having it's just constantly filling gaps. It's difficult in terms of staff time and then obviously in terms of money. So what, from all of your perspectives, should the library digital market look like? Licensing or ownership? What would costs be? What do you think would be fair to publishers, authors, and libraries?
I'm happy to. I've been saying the same thing for probably 14 years on this particular topic. What I would love to see, and what makes sense in other markets outside the book industry, is pricing that varies depending on what you're purchasing. So the idea of books that you're buying that you can buy 2 different versions of the same book. And so that an individual library, when a new book comes out, buys 1 ownership copy at a higher price. And in the case of Vancouver, 80 copies that are a 2-year license. And at the end, this is a really popular book, at the end of the 2 years, we don't need 80 perpetual of the 2-year licenses anymore. Maybe we drop down to 10. And 10 of them take us through another 2 years, and then 4 years have passed, and all we have left is the 1 owned copy. In an ideal world for libraries, and I think this would also work for publishers, we would have choices and we'd have the option to meet the needs of our patrons in this environment where things are very popular for short bursts of time, but we really want to be able to address the preservation of local content. And so what we choose to preserve over time will vary from one library to another. So that's my ideal world from a library perspective, is that the short-term licenses cost less, the ownership model costs more, and we are making a mix that works the best for our community.
Far be it for me to correct Christina, she's much more expert, but I would say for a lot of our libraries, the time-bound are not the preferred, and I would suggest bundles of lens also can fill that same role. So it could be an own copy, and we have a bundle of 40, 10 at a time that's been very popular that can help you kind of satisfy that holds queue without an unreasonable number of copies, there 10 years later. And we're expanding in the Palace project our preferred models, which include like a bundle of 100 simultaneous uses. That works well often for really big libraries that need a lot of lens of a popular book, a bundle of five at a time. So not to disagree, but just to say, in addition to the ownership model, some mix, which I would say could be time bound and could also be bundles of lens that don't expire with time. And those really seem fair to both sides, right? If the book is long, we came up with the 40-10 at a time by talking to a lot of publishers, a lot of libraries, and we looked at some maybe a little older library studies that were saying, a physical book usually wears out after somewhere in the ballpark of 50 lens. It sounds like it varies a little bit based on the genre of the book and who's borrowing it, but that's the ballpark. So we went a little less and said, okay, we'll have the digital license also wear out after 40 lens. That's a little conservative, but the library gets the benefit of being able to lend it to 10 people at a time. So I think they're that's another attractive option. And I just to call attention to Guy Gonzalez has been a kind of an industry thought leader and consultant for a long time in this space, and has asked some good questions about sort of where this goes next, and if it's a canary in the coal mine. I think, just to answer his question live, Guy, I think this is I think what this proves is, there have been moments over the last decade where libraries and publishers have felt oppositional. And especially with some big five publishers. And I think that is not the right posture and not how it has to be. And I think that what we have proven in the past few years is that, especially independent, and I don't want to say smaller. I mean, we're talking potentially large, mid-sized publishers, but basically outside the big five, publishers want to work with libraries. They want their books to be discovered in libraries. They want the library revenue. Especially older books, they really want them present. Authors want their books to be found in libraries for posterity. And there's a lot of room for win-win arrangements, including this one, and bundles that have reasonable prices and don't expire, potentially collections of content. So I think that our goal is to keep the market from calcifying and keep innovating to see what ends up sticking for both sides. So I do think this is another good piece of evidence that there's a lot of room for us to work together in a positive way.
I'll
So
just chip
just
in
a
and
quick
say I don't
comments from-
disagree with Micah at all. That both time-based licenses and circ-based bundles are great. What it's about is having choices so that we can best meet
So
our
what
community.
it sounds like we're hearing from libraries is options that will allow us to use our limited resources the best that we can. And I see some comments in the chat that are basically agreeing with that. Jude says, definitely an ownership archival option should be on the table if libraries are best going to be able to fulfill their function, which is why we're here talking about this model. Micah, you mentioned the big five. For all panelists, what do you think it will take to nudge, say, the big five towards the possibility of an ownership model? Is there any room there for that to work? Could this initiative be something that you hope that they would look at and see as an option?
I have a quick answer to that. One of the things that I think, we've seen over the last sort of 10 years is that publishers have come in and said, especially the big five publishers, I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone that Richard works with, have come in and said, look, we have a bunch of needs and requirements. And, when I opened my little blurb talking about how, ownership is a sort of balance between different factors. And one of the things that licensing has allowed publishers to do is to come in and say, we're going to prioritize our concerns and needs when we structure these. And one of the great things that we're seeing out of Palace and seeing just sort of generally is an awareness among libraries and librarians that they have the capacity to push back, and they have to push back. Like publishers are going to, by and large, are going to take what they can get, and they're going to come in and say, we have these concerns, and if nothing is stopping us from structuring this deal in a way that addresses the concerns, like we're going to prioritize them. And so watching libraries and librarians and library systems come together and recognize that, as Micah said, as Richard said, as Christina said, like publishers want to get into the libraries. They have a lot of power if they use it. And then also to the extent that like their power isn't enough, licensing and sales is a legal structure. We were seeing policymakers come in and say, look, this balance that has worked for centuries and millennia is a little bit broken in the ebook licensing space. And so we are going to rebalance everything through law and through statute is also another path. But even getting that passed also requires libraries and librarians to stand up and say, look, we have needs too. We have things we need to do. And it is legitimate for us to demand those in the market, not because it's an inherently adversarial process, but just because like it is okay to say, we need this to work for us, and we're going to ask for these 10 things. And if we can only address 7 of them, that's better than just saying, we'll take whatever the publishers say is important to them.
Can I build on that? One thing, absolutely, I think what Michael emphasized is really important. And one thing that I just want to, shout out about Palace, I mean, that's really why this started, was we felt like we needed a nonprofit, that could really be a representative of the library's interests in those discussions with publishers. And I think in lots of cases, we found that, the distributors, some of the distributors in between libraries and publishers were actually introducing a lot of constraints and just didn't always have their interests completely aligned with the libraries. And so I think by having an actor that is hopefully much more responsive to libraries and aligned with their interests, we can make a lot of progress. The other thing to Michael's initial question about what would move the big 5, I think for any library on the line that's listening, anyone that buys books, I would say it's the power of the purse. And too often libraries have been, in economic terms, a cost insensitive buyer, right? So they're just buying what patrons want at whatever it costs, grumbling about it, but still buying it. And that in economic terms creates an inelastic demand curve, right? So a demand curve where no matter what the price is, the buyer still buys it. So the seller's incentive is to put the price high. And I think that's what we've seen a little bit with the big 5 licensing models. So to the great, we are talking with a number of our partner libraries who are doing differentiated holds queues. So they will let the holds go really long if it's a high price 2-year license. I would say for libraries on the line, if you can buy these IPG titles and others that are offered at a reasonable price on good terms at a 2-to-1 holds ratio, you will reward those publishers for offering something reasonable and let the $100 2-year license go to a 20-to-1 holds ratio. If libraries would do that, publishers would really take notice because they do want that library revenue. So a lot of more of the power is with libraries than they sometimes think, I think, to influence the market, reward publishers that are doing library friendly models, and give other publishers an incentive to get on board.
Well, Micah, you just stole my thunder there. I was going to say the exact same thing. Thank you so much. What I'd say to librarians out there is take a look at these titles. There's some really good stuff here. It's not necessarily as well known as the best-selling authors, but it's well worth a read. So look at the curation core, what they have to say about it. Feature some of these titles. Start working with folks that do give us a better deal, and see if we can't make things more sustainable. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to bring us to a close. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Absolutely. Such a fantastic conversation this afternoon. I want to extend our thanks to Michael and Christina and Micah and Richard, and also to Michael for serving as moderator for the conversation. As a reminder, the conversation this afternoon was brought to you by the Digital Public Library of America, Readers First, and the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies. And this has been part of our ongoing series of collaborating for access. As participants today, we hope that you found this conversation valuable. And if you have ideas for us on future topics you'd like us to tackle, please reach out and let us know where we should move next in this conversation as we continue to strive for access for all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you and have a good afternoon. Take care.